I'm going on a date with my coworker tonight. Olivia said it like she was reminding me to take out the trash, calm, flat, like it didn't matter, like I didn't matter, and for a second I just stood there in the kitchen, one hand still resting on the back of the chair, the smell of overcooked steak hanging in the air, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and waits to see what kind of man you are, and I remember thinking how strange it was that after 8 years of marriage. That was the moment everything finally made sense. Not when she started coming home late, not when her phone began living face down on every surface, not when conversations turned into transactions, but right there, under the soft yellow light above our dining table, with her heels still on and her coat draped over one arm like she wasn't planning to stay long. That was the moment the illusion dropped clean away. And I didn't raise my voice, I didn't ask who he was, I didn't ask why. Because deep down I already knew all of that didn't matter anymore, so I pulled out the chair slowly, sat down, and said the only thing that felt true. Great. Then sign this. She blinked, just once, like her brain needed an extra second to catch up, and I reached into the folder I'd left on the table hours earlier, sliding a thin stack of papers across the wood between us, the sound soft but final, like something closing that wasn't meant to open again, and for a second she just stared at it, then at me, a small laugh slipping out, sharp and dismissive. Like she thought this was a joke she hadn't been let in on yet. What is this, Ethan? She asked, tilting her head. The way she used to when she still thought I was someone she could read, and I leaned back in my chair, letting the distance sit there between us, steady, measured. Just something I think you should look at before your date, I said, keeping my voice even, the way you do when you're not trying to win an argument anymore, just trying to end one, and she rolled her eyes, dropping her coat over the back of the chair as if she had all the time in the world, as if nothing about this night had weight, flipping the first page with a kind of careless confidence that told me she still believed she was in control, that whatever game she thought she was playing, she assumed I was still playing it too, but I wasn't, not anymore, because somewhere between the late nights and the quiet dismissals, between the way her voice changed when she talked about work and the way it flattened when she talked to me, I had stopped reacting and started watching. Stopped asking and started noticing patterns, timing, the subtle shift in priorities that most people miss because they're too busy trying to fix something that's already broken. And I remember the exact night it clicked, not dramatic, not loud, just a simple moment where she smiled at her phone in a way she hadn't smiled at me in years, and something inside me didn't crack. It went quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't come back from, so I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse her. I didn't beg for explanations. I just made a call the next morning, then another, then a few more after that, and piece by piece, I started putting things in order, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of clarity, the kind that comes when you finally accept that the person sitting across from you isn't the one you married anymore. And now here we were, her standing at the edge of a choice she didn't realize she'd already made. Her fingers pausing halfway down the second page as her expression shifted just slightly, not fear yet, not understanding, just the first hint that something wasn't lining up the way she expected, and I watched her, calm, steady, like I had all night, because for the first time in a long time, I did. Her eyes slowed on the third page, not dramatically, not enough for someone who did not know her to notice. But I did, because I had spent years learning the difference between her real reactions and the ones she performed. And this one was real, subtle, controlled, but real, and she shifted her weight slightly, like the ground under her had tilted just enough to make her adjust. What is this supposed to be? She asked, her tone still holding on to that edge of dismissal, but thinner now, stretched tighter than before, and I folded my hands on the table, steady, giving her nothing but space to keep reading, because the truth does not need to be rushed, it only needs to be seen, and she flipped another page, slower this time, her fingers no longer careless, the confidence starting to fracture in small, quiet ways, the kind that do not announce themselves but change everything once they settle in. It is just paperwork, I said, calm, measured, the same tone I used when discussing something routine, something ordinary, because that was the point. I was not reacting, I was concluding, and she let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it did not fully form, her eyes scanning lines she clearly had not expected to see, legal terms, structures, clauses that do not belong in casual conversations, and she looked up at me again, longer this time, searching for something, maybe anger. Maybe weakness, maybe the version of me she thought she understood. But she did not find it, and that unsettled her more than anything written on those pages. "You are being dramatic," she said, but the words landed softer than she intended, like they were testing the room instead of controlling it, and I shook my head once, slow, not in disagreement, but in finality. "No," I said quietly. "I stopped being dramatic a long time ago." And that was true, because drama requires emotion, requires reaction, and somewhere along the way, I had stepped out of that cycle. Replaced it with something quieter, something colder, something that did not ask for permission, and she dropped her gaze back to the papers, faster now, flipping ahead as if the answer might be waiting further down, as if skipping could undo what she had already seen. But it does not work like that. Once a pattern reveals itself, you cannot unsee it, and I watched the exact moment it started to connect for her. The small tightening around her eyes, the pause between pages, the way her lips pressed together like she was holding back a question she was not ready to ask, and I let the silence stretch, because silence has weight when the right person is holding it, and finally she set the papers down, not gently, not aggressively, just enough to mark a shift. "This does not make any sense," she said, and there it was, the first crack of uncertainty breaking through the surface, and I leaned forward just slightly, not enough to close the distance, just enough to make the words land where they needed to. "It makes perfect sense," I replied, my voice even, steady as ever. "You just did not realize when it started." And she stared at me, really stared this time, like she was seeing someone new sitting across from her, someone she had not accounted for, someone she had underestimated, and for the first time that night, she did not have an immediate response, no quick remark, no dismissive laugh, just silence, and in that silence, the balance shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because control does not disappear all at once, it slips piece by piece. Until the person who thought they had it realizes they never did, and I could see that realization beginning to form behind her eyes, slow, reluctant, but inevitable. She leaned back slightly, like distance might give her clarity, like space could turn what she just read into something smaller, something manageable, but it did not work that way, not with documents like these, not with decisions that had already been set in motion long before tonight, and I watched her try to reassemble control piece by piece, her fingers tapping once against the edge of the paper, a habit she had when she was thinking. Calculating, searching for an angle. "When did you even do this?" she asked, and there it was, not anger, not yet, but something closer to disbelief, like she could not quite accept that I had moved without her noticing, and I gave a small shrug, not careless, just honest. "A while ago," I said, because the exact timing did not matter anymore. What mattered was that it had already been done, already signed, already set into place in ways that could not be undone by a conversation at a dinner table, and she exhaled slowly, her eyes dropping back to the pages again, but this time she was not skimming, she was searching, looking for a flaw, a loophole, something she could grab onto and turn back in her favor, and I recognized that look too. It was the same one she used at work, the one that told people she was always 2 steps ahead, always in control. But tonight she was reading a map that had been drawn without her, and that changes everything. "This is not fair," she said finally, and the words hung there, softer than they should have been, like even she was not fully convinced, and I let a small breath leave my chest, not a sigh, not frustration, just acknowledgement. "Fair. Stopped being part of this a long time ago," I replied, and she shook her head quickly, sharper now, trying to push back. "You cannot just decide something like this on your own," she said, her voice rising just a fraction, enough to show the shift, enough to reveal the first real edge of panic underneath, and I held her gaze steady, unshaken. "I did not decide it tonight," I said, each word measured, placed carefully. "Tonight is just when you noticed." And that hit, I could see it in the way her shoulders tightened, in the way her posture changed from relaxed to alert, like someone who had just realized they were not standing where they thought they were, and she looked down again, flipping back to the first page, slower now, rereading lines she had already passed, as if the meaning might change the second time, as if the reality might soften if she gave it another look, but it did not, and the silence between us grew heavier. Not empty, but full, filled with everything neither of us was saying out loud, the years, the small dismissals, the quiet shifts that led us here, and I let it sit, because there was no need to fill it, no need to explain what she was already beginning to understand, and after a long moment, she spoke again, quieter this time. So what happens if I do not sign it? And that was the question, the real one, not about the past, not about fairness, but about control, about options, about what she still had left, and I leaned back slightly, giving her the space to hear the answer clearly. Then nothing changes, I said calmly. You still go on your date, you still do whatever you have already decided to do. And I paused just long enough for the next part to land the way it needed to. The only difference is what you walk away with after. And she went still, completely still, the kind of stillness that does not come from calm, but from realization, and in that moment, the last piece clicked into place for her, not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to understand that this was not a reaction, not a bluff, not something she could talk her way around. This was a structure, something built quietly over time. Something solid, and for the first time since she walked into the room, she did not look confident, she looked uncertain, and that uncertainty was louder than anything either of us could have said. She did not answer right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said, because Olivia was never someone who stayed quiet unless she was recalculating, unless something had shifted beyond what she could immediately control, and I watched her pick up the pen from the table, not to sign, not yet, but to hold it, to feel it, like it might anchor her back into a position she recognized. And she tapped it lightly against the paper once, twice, the rhythm uneven now, no longer the confident cadence she carried into boardrooms and negotiations. You planned this, she said finally, her voice lower, steadier than before, but not as certain, and I gave a small nod, not proud, not defensive, just acknowledging the truth as it was. I prepared, I said, and there is a difference, a quiet but important one, because planning comes from intent to act, but preparation comes from understanding what is coming whether you want it or not, and she let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting past me for a second, like she was trying to place when exactly things cross the point of no return, and that is the part most people miss. It is never one moment, never one decision, it is a series of small shifts that build until there is nothing left to hold on to. And she looked back at me again, sharper now, a trace of frustration breaking through. You should have talked to me, she said, and for a moment I almost smiled, not out of humor, but because of how familiar that line sounded. How late it always arrives, and I leaned forward slightly, my voice still calm, still controlled. I did, I said. Just not in the way you expected. And she frowned, confusion mixing with irritation, and I let the words settle before continuing. Every time I asked where you were and you said work, every time I tried to have dinner and you said you were busy, every time I noticed something was off and you told me I was overthinking, that was me talking. I said, not raising my voice, not accusing, just stating facts the way they existed, and she opened her mouth slightly like she wanted to respond, but nothing came out right away, because the truth does not always come with a clean defense, and she looked down at the papers again, slower this time, not searching for errors anymore, but understanding structure, understanding consequence, and her grip on the pen tightened just a little. Enough to show the tension building under the surface. So this is it then? She asked quietly. And there was something different in her tone now, less edge, more weight, like she was finally stepping into the reality of the situation instead of trying to push against it, and I met her eyes, steady, unflinching. This is what comes next, I said, because there is no single ending, only transitions, and she sat there for a moment, completely still, the kind of stillness that feels heavier than movement, and then she set the pen down, carefully this time, not tapping, not fidgeting, just placing it beside the papers like she needed both hands free to process what she was facing, and she leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, her eyes moving around the room, taking in the familiar space like it suddenly felt unfamiliar, like the life she had been moving through on autopilot had just shifted into something else entirely. And when she looked back at me again, there was no dismissal left, no casual tone. Just a quiet question she was not sure she wanted answered. "And if I sign it?" And I held her gaze for a second before responding, not rushing, not pressing, just letting the words come when they needed to. "Then you go wherever you were already planning to go," I said. "And I go somewhere else." And the simplicity of it landed heavier than anything complicated ever could, because sometimes the most controlled endings are the ones that sound the quietest. She did not respond right away, and I could see the weight of the decision settling in, not dramatic, not explosive, just heavy in the way real consequences always are, and she reached for the papers again, slower this time, more deliberate, like every movement needed to be thought through before it happened, and I noticed how different she looked now compared to just minutes ago. The sharp confidence softened into something more careful, more aware, and she ran her finger along one of the lines without actually reading it, as if tracing the structure might help her understand how she had ended up here. "You really think I would just walk away from everything?" she asked, her voice quieter now, not challenging, just testing the reality in front of her, and I tilted my head slightly, considering the question, not because I needed time to answer, but because it deserved an honest response. "I think you already did," I said calmly, and that landed not like a blow, but like a realization that had been waiting for the right moment to surface, and she looked up at me again, her expression tightening just slightly, not anger, not yet, but something closer to discomfort, like a truth she did not want to fully accept had just been placed directly in front of her. "Going out one night is not the same as walking away," she said, trying to reframe it, trying to bring it back into something smaller, something manageable, and I gave a small nod, acknowledging the logic on the surface. "You are right," I said. "One night is not everything." And I let a brief pause sit between us before continuing. "But it is never just one night." And the silence that followed was different now, heavier, because she understood what I meant, even if she did not want to say it out loud, and she looked down again, flipping another page, slower, absorbing, no longer searching for flaws but recognizing the design, and I watched as the realization continued to build, layer by layer, the way it always does when something shifts from theory to reality. "So you just decided to protect yourself," she said after a moment, and there was something in her tone now that had not been there before, not accusation, not entirely, but something closer to reluctant understanding, and I met her gaze steadily. "Yes," I said, simple, direct, without apology, because there was nothing to apologize for anymore, and she let out a slow breath, leaning back again, her eyes drifting briefly toward the window like she needed a second to step outside the moment without actually leaving the room, and when she looked back, there was a different kind of question there, one that went deeper than the papers, deeper than the situation itself. "When did you stop trusting me?" she asked, and that one lingered not because it was difficult, but because it was honest, and I took a moment before answering, not to soften it, but to make sure it was clear. "I did not stop all at once," I said, my voice even. "It happened in pieces." And I watched her absorb that, watched the way her expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to show that she was beginning to see the timeline differently, not as a single event, but as a pattern, and I continued. "Every time something did not add up, every time I felt like I was the only one trying to hold things together, every time I noticed you pulling away and you told me nothing was wrong, that is when it started." And I let that sit, because it needed to, because understanding does not come from rushing through the truth, it comes from letting it settle, and she did not interrupt, did not argue, just listened, which told me more than any response could have, and after a long moment, she looked back down at the papers again, her hand hovering near the pen but not touching it this time, as if the decision itself had become heavier than the action required to make it, and the room felt smaller now, not physically, but in the way space changes when everything unspoken finally comes into focus. And I sat there quietly, not pushing, not guiding, just waiting, because for the first time in a long time, the next move was not mine to make. The silence stretched longer this time, not tense in the way arguments are, but dense, like the air had thickened with everything that had finally been said out loud, and Olivia did not move for several seconds, her eyes fixed on the papers as if they might rearrange themselves into something less final if she waited long enough, and I could see the shift happening in real time, not sudden, not dramatic, just gradual. The way certainty erodes when it meets something stronger than it expected, and she reached for the pen again. Slower than before, her fingers wrapping around it with less confidence, more awareness, like she understood now that this was not a gesture, not a symbolic act, but a decision with weight that would not be undone later with a conversation or an apology, and she tapped it once against the paper, then stopped, the sound cutting off mid-rhythm. "If I sign this," she said quietly, not looking at me yet, "there is no going back, is there?" And I let a brief pause settle between us before answering. Not because I needed to think, but because the truth deserves space. "No," I said, my voice steady. "There is not." And she nodded slightly, almost to herself, as if confirming something she already knew, and when she finally looked up, there was something different in her expression now, not just uncertainty, but a kind of clarity that comes when the options narrow down to something real, something unavoidable, and she held my gaze for a moment, searching again, but this time not for weakness. Not for control, just for confirmation. "And if I do not?" she asked, and I answered the same way I had before, calm, direct, without adding anything unnecessary. "Then nothing changes tonight," I said, "but everything still changes after." And that was the part people misunderstand, that choosing not to act does not stop the outcome, it only delays the moment it becomes visible, and she exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance of the reality in front of her, and she looked back down at the papers one more time, her eyes moving across the lines with a different kind of focus now, not trying to find a way out, but understanding exactly what each word meant, what each clause protected, what each signature would confirm, and I watched as her grip on the pen tightened just enough to show the tension still there beneath the surface, because even when the mind understands, the rest of you takes longer to catch up, and she hovered there for a second, the tip of the pen just above the line, not touching it yet, like that small distance still represented a choice, still represented control. And then she paused again, pulling the pen back slightly, her brow furrowing as another thought surfaced. "You already separated everything, did you not?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more measured, and I gave a small nod, not elaborating, not explaining the details, because she did not need them. She had already read enough to understand the structure, the protections, the way the foundation had been secured without her noticing, and that realization settled over her in a way that words could not, and she let out a slow breath, longer. This time, her gaze drifting for just a second before returning to the paper, and when she spoke again, there was no sharpness left, no edge, just a quiet acknowledgement of what this moment had become. "You were not reacting," she said, almost to herself. "You were finishing something." And I did not correct her, because she was right, and she lowered the pen once more, closer this time, the distance between decision and action shrinking until it was almost nothing, and the room felt completely still, like everything had narrowed down to that single point, that single line, that single moment where intention becomes irreversible, and I sat there without moving, without speaking, because there was nothing left to add, nothing left to push, only the quiet understanding that whatever happened next would not be undone, and for the first time since she walked in, Olivia did not look like someone in control of the situation. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a choice that would define everything after. The pen touched the paper, but she did not move it right away, and that hesitation said everything, because Olivia was never someone who hesitated, not in decisions, not in conversations, not in anything that required certainty, and yet here she was, frozen in the smallest movement, as if even that fraction of an inch carried more weight than she expected, and I watched her carefully, not judging, not reacting, just observing the moment for what it was, the exact point where everything shifts from possibility into reality, and she lifted the pen again, just slightly, pulling it back like the contact itself had been too much, like crossing that line required something she had not fully gathered yet. "This is not how this was supposed to go," she said quietly, her voice no longer sharp, no longer controlled, but thinner now, like it was stretching to hold on to something that was already slipping, and I did not interrupt, did not correct her, because she was not talking to me anymore, not really. She was talking to the version of this night she had imagined before she walked through the door, and that version was gone, replaced by something she had not prepared for, something she had not accounted for, and she looked up at me again, searching, not for answers this time, but for some sign that this could still be redirected, still be negotiated. "You are really okay with this?" she asked, and there was something almost fragile in the question, something that would have mattered weeks ago, months ago, maybe even a year ago, but now it landed differently, and I held her gaze steady, not cold, not emotional, just clear. "I am okay with reality," I said, and that was the truth, simple and complete, and she stared at me for a moment longer, as if trying to reconcile that answer with the man she thought she knew, and then her eyes dropped back to the paper, slower this time, more deliberate, and without another word, she lowered the pen again, this time not stopping, not pulling back, just moving it across the line in one clean motion, her signature forming in a way that was practiced. Automatic, but carrying a weight that neither of us ignored, and when she finished, she set the pen down immediately, like holding on to it any longer would change something, and the room went completely still, the kind of stillness that does not come from silence alone, but from finality, from the understanding that something irreversible has just happened, and she looked at the paper for a second longer, then slowly pushed it back toward me, not aggressively, not reluctantly, just letting it go, and I reached forward, taking it without hesitation, without ceremony, because there was no need for either, the action itself had already said everything, and I glanced down briefly, confirming what I already knew, then closed the folder with a soft, controlled motion, the sound barely audible but definitive, and when I looked back up, she was watching me, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something quieter, something more complex, and for the first time that night, she seemed smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence, like the space she had occupied with certainty had shifted, leaving something else in its place, and she leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, her eyes moving around the room again, taking it in like it belonged to a different life now, and after a long moment she spoke again, her voice steady but softer than before. "So that is it," she said, not asking, not challenging, just stating what she now understood, and I nodded once, not adding anything more, because there was nothing left to explain, and she let that sit, absorbing it fully this time, no resistance, no attempt to reshape it, just acceptance, and then she reached for her coat again, slower than before, more deliberate, like every movement now carried a different meaning, and as she stood, there was no hesitation, no pause to reconsider, just a quiet continuation of the path she had already chosen, and I remained where I was, watching without reaction, because this was never about stopping her, it was about making sure that when she walked out, she understood exactly what she was leaving behind. She slipped her coat over her shoulders with a kind of careful precision that did not match the woman who had walked in earlier, every movement measured now, deliberate, like she was aware that even the smallest action carried weight, and she adjusted the collar slightly before reaching for her phone on the counter, her fingers hovering over the screen for a brief second before unlocking it, and I could see the reflection of the light in her eyes, that familiar glow of connection to a world outside this room, outside this moment, and for a second it almost felt like the old pattern might resume, like she would step back into that version of herself and leave everything here behind without another thought, but it did not happen that way, not anymore. And she lowered the phone slowly, her grip loosening just enough to show the hesitation she could not fully hide. "He is probably waiting," she said, her voice softer than before, not asking for permission, not offering explanation, just stating a fact that no longer held the same certainty it once did, and I nodded once, not because it mattered, but because acknowledgement is sometimes the only response left, and she glanced at the folder in front of me, the one now closed, now final, and there was a flicker of something in her expression, not regret exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes too late to change the outcome but early enough to understand it. "You are not even going to ask me to stay," she said after a moment, and there was something different in the way she said it, not accusatory, not defensive, just curious in a way that suggested she already knew the answer, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, my voice calm, steady, unchanged. "No," I said, and I let the silence follow without filling it, because there was nothing to add to that, nothing that would make it clearer than it already was, and she watched me for a second longer, searching again, maybe for hesitation, maybe for something that would make this feel less final, but she did not find it, and that absence spoke louder than anything else could have, and she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, like she was confirming something to herself, not to me, and she turned toward the door. Her steps slower than they had been when she entered, each one deliberate. Grounded, like she was walking through a space that no longer belonged to her in the same way, and when she reached the handle, she paused, just for a second, her hand resting against it without turning, and I could see the hesitation there again, smaller this time, quieter, but still present, and she spoke without turning around, her voice barely above a calm tone. "You really thought this through?" And I did not respond right away, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer was already in everything that had happened, in every moment leading up to this one, and after a brief pause, I said simply, "I had time." And she let out a slow breath, almost like a quiet acknowledgement, and then she opened the door, the sound soft but distinct in the stillness of the room, and for a moment she stood there, half inside, half outside, like the boundary itself held meaning, like crossing it was not just physical but something more permanent, and then she stepped through, the door closing behind her with a controlled, quiet click, and just like that, the space changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but completely. The kind of change that does not announce itself but settles into everything at once, and I remained where I was, sitting at the table, the folder resting in front of me, untouched now, unnecessary to reopen, because what it contained had already done its job, and the house felt different, not empty, not broken, just quiet in a way that felt honest for the first time in a long while, and I let that quiet settle, not rushing to fill it, not reaching for anything to replace what had just left. Because some endings are not meant to be softened, they are meant to be understood, and as the minutes passed, I realized something simple, something clear, that this was not the moment everything fell apart, it was the moment everything finally aligned with what it had already become. The quiet did not feel empty, it felt earned, like something that had been waiting beneath the surface for a long time had finally been allowed to exist without interruption, and I sat there for a while without moving, not because I did not know what to do next, but because there was no urgency left in anything, no need to react, no need to fix, no need to chase after something that had already chosen its direction. And I reached for the folder again, opening it slowly, not out of doubt, but out of habit, scanning the signature one more time, Olivia Carter written in the same steady script she had used for years, the same confidence in the lines, but carrying a completely different meaning now, and I closed it again just as calmly, setting it aside without ceremony, because its purpose had already been fulfilled, and the room around me felt clearer somehow, not brighter, not lighter, just honest. Like the version of our life that had been layered with assumptions and half-truths had been stripped down to what was actually there, and I leaned back in the chair, letting the stillness settle into something steady, something real, and for the first time in a long while, my thoughts were not racing ahead trying to solve something, they were simply present, observing, understanding, and I realized how much of my energy had been spent holding together something that no longer held itself. How much of my time had been invested in maintaining a version of us that had quietly stopped existing, and that realization did not come with anger, it came with clarity, the kind that removes the need for it, and I stood up slowly, pushing the chair back with a soft sound that echoed just slightly in the quiet house, and walked toward the kitchen, picking up the plates from the table, the dinner that had gone cold hours ago still sitting untouched, and I moved through the motions without thinking, rinsing, placing, restoring order in a way that felt simple and controlled, because sometimes the smallest actions are the ones that bring everything back into focus. And as I stood there at the sink, looking out through the window into the dark street beyond, I thought about what came next, not in terms of loss, not in terms of starting over, but in terms of direction, because this was not an ending that left a void, it was one that created space, and space is something you can build from. Something you can shape without the weight of what no longer belongs there, and I dried my hands slowly, setting the towel down, and walked back into the living room, the house quiet around me in a way that felt different now, not heavy, not tense, just still, and I picked up my keys from the counter, turning them once in my hand, feeling the solid weight of something simple and certain, and for a moment I paused, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, taking in the space one last time as it was, before anything else changed, and then I moved toward the door, opening it with the same calm, controlled motion, stepping out into the night air that felt cooler, sharper. Like it carried a clarity the inside no longer needed to hold, and as I closed the door behind me, I did not look back, not because I was avoiding it, but because there was nothing left behind that required it, and I walked forward, steady, unhurried, knowing that whatever came next would not be built on what had just ended, but on the understanding that came from it, and that was something no one could take, no one could undo, something earned in silence, in restraint, in choosing not to react until the moment mattered. And now that it had, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to hold on to, only the quiet certainty of moving forward without needing permission from the past.